Imagine a world where the hero of time's victory was absolute. No diverging paths, no alternate realities, no shattered timelines splintering into three separate histories. What if Ocarina of Time's ending created just one singular future for Hyrule? This isn't just a fun thought experiment. This question fundamentally rewrites the entire Legend of Zelda saga. The implications are staggering, the possibilities are endless, and what we're about to uncover changes everything you thought you knew about the series. For over 2 decades, Zelda fans have wrestled with the franchise's infamous timeline split. When Link pulled the Master Sword from the pedestal and became the hero of time, he didn't just defeat Ganondorf, he fractured history itself. Nintendo's official timeline reveals 3 separate branches: the adult timeline, where Link defeats Ganon and is sent back in time; the child timeline, where young Link warns Hyrule about Ganondorf's treachery; and the downfall timeline, where the hero of time actually fails in his quest. But here's the question that's been haunting theorists since the timeline was officially revealed. What if none of that happened? What if time remained unbroken, flowing forward in one continuous stream? What if the events of Ocarina of Time led to just one definitive future? Let's tear down the timeline we know and rebuild it from scratch. The first thing we need to understand is how the timeline split actually occurred. When Link defeated Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time's climax, Princess Zelda used the Ocarina of Time to send the hero of time back 7 years to his childhood, a well-intentioned act meant to give Link back the years stolen from him. This single action created the adult timeline, where Ganondorf was sealed away but Link was gone, and the child timeline, where young Link warns Hyrule about Ganondorf's treachery, and the downfall timeline, where the hero of time actually fails in his quest. But now imagine all of that complexity gone, erased, simplified into one singular path forward. In our unified timeline, we need to establish a single canonical outcome for the hero of time's adventure. The most logical progression: Link defeats Ganondorf, the King of Evil is sealed within the Sacred Realm by the combined efforts of the 7 sages, and time continues forward without Zelda sending Link back to his childhood. Link remains in the adult era, having saved Hyrule, and history progresses naturally from that point. This one change, keeping Link in the adult timeline and preventing temporal manipulation, creates a cascade of differences that reshape the entire Zelda mythos. First, let's talk about Ganondorf himself. In the split timeline, Ganondorf's power and influence are divided across 3 separate realities. In the adult timeline, he's sealed but eventually breaks free in Wind Waker. In the child timeline, he's executed but his hatred lingers and transforms into the entity we see in Twilight Princess. In the downfall timeline, he claims the full Triforce and becomes an unstoppable force that terrorizes Hyrule for generations. But in a unified timeline, Ganondorf's threat becomes singular and absolute. Without the timeline split diluting his presence across 3 realities, Ganondorf's sealed form in the Sacred Realm becomes the one continuous threat that Hyrule must confront for centuries to come. His malice doesn't splinter into different manifestations. It concentrates, it intensifies, it becomes a focused evil that future generations must reckon with in one unbroken chain of causality. Think about what this means for Ganondorf's character development. Instead of being 3 different versions of himself in 3 different timelines, he becomes a singular antagonist whose influence evolves and grows within one continuous history. His hatred doesn't fragment, it compounds. Every attempt to break his seal, every manifestation of his malevolent will, every resurrection or reincarnation becomes part of a direct, linear progression of evil. This creates a Ganondorf who is potentially more dangerous than any of his timeline split counterparts, because his power isn't divided, it's consolidated. But here's where it gets really interesting. If Ganondorf's threat is singular and continuous, would he actually be easier to defeat? Think about it. In the fragmented timeline, Hyrule has to deal with Ganondorf in 3 separate realities, with 3 different sets of circumstances, 3 different heroes, 3 different outcomes. But in a unified timeline, every lesson learned about defeating Ganondorf, every strategy developed, every piece of wisdom about combating his evil becomes part of one accumulated body of knowledge. The 7 sages who sealed Ganondorf after Ocarina of Time would pass down their wisdom directly to future generations. The seal they created wouldn't exist in 3 different states. It would be one seal, maintained and reinforced over centuries by an unbroken line of guardians. Hyrule's ability to resist Ganondorf's influence would strengthen with each generation, because the knowledge wouldn't be reset or lost in parallel timelines. It would build. This brings us to the Triforce itself. In the split timeline, the Triforce is divided and reunited multiple times across different realities. In our unified timeline, the Triforce's fate following Ocarina of Time becomes a critical question. After Ganondorf's defeat, Link possesses the Triforce of Courage, Zelda holds the Triforce of Wisdom, and Ganondorf retains the Triforce of Power even in his sealed state. In a continuous timeline, these 3 pieces would maintain their positions with their respective bearers for generations. The Triforce wouldn't scatter and reform repeatedly across multiple realities. It would remain with the bloodlines and spiritual successors of these 3 individuals. This creates a fascinating dynamic. Instead of the Triforce being a prize to be claimed and lost over and over across different timelines, it becomes a set of divine artifacts passed down through specific lineages. The Triforce of Courage becomes an heirloom of Link's spiritual successors. The Triforce of Wisdom remains with Hyrule's royal family, and the Triforce of Power stays sealed with Ganondorf, a constant reminder of the dark power that must never be unleashed. The absence of timeline manipulation means the Triforce's role shifts from being a plot device that resets with each reality to being a continuous element of Hyrule's divine heritage. The golden power becomes less about wish-granting chaos and more about the eternal balance between courage, wisdom, and power playing out across centuries of unified history. Now, let's talk about the massive elephant in the room. What happens to the games that depend on the timeline split? Majora's Mask is the most immediate casualty of our unified timeline. In the child timeline, young Link, sent back to his childhood, searches for Navi and stumbles into Termina, where he must prevent the moon from destroying the land in 3 days. This adventure is only possible because Zelda sent Link back in time. In our unified timeline, where Link remains an adult after defeating Ganondorf, the events of Majora's Mask as we know them cannot happen. But that doesn't mean Termina disappears from existence. Instead, Majora's Mask would need to be completely reconceptualized. Perhaps adult Link, after saving Hyrule and searching for his departed fairy companion, discovers the path to Termina. The dynamics would shift dramatically. Instead of a child wearing transformation masks, we'd have an experienced hero, the legendary hero of time himself, confronting Majora's malevolent power. The story would lose some of its poignant themes about childhood, loss, and growing up, but it would gain new dimensions. An adult Link in Termina would bring the full weight of his experience as Hyrule's savior. The 3-day cycle would test not just his courage, but his accumulated wisdom. Skull Kid's possession by Majora's Mask would contrast against a hero who has already defeated the King of Evil. The happy mask salesman's quest to reclaim Majora's Mask would take on new urgency, not just to save Termina, but to prevent this ancient evil from somehow reaching Hyrule and threatening the fragile peace Link fought so hard to establish. Termina's crisis becomes part of Link's continuous journey, rather than a separate adventure in a parallel timeline. But the real game changer is what happens to The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Wind Waker exists because of a specific sequence of events in the adult timeline. After Link defeats Ganondorf and Zelda sends him back to childhood, the adult timeline continues without Link. The hero of time is no longer there. When Ganondorf eventually breaks free from his seal centuries later, there's no Link to stop him. The gods have no choice but to flood Hyrule, sealing Ganondorf beneath an endless ocean and forcing the survivors to live on mountaintops that become islands. In our unified timeline, this tragedy might never occur.
Without the flood, there's no Great Sea, no island civilizations, no Rito evolved from Zora, no submerged Hyrule Castle waiting beneath the waves. Wind Waker's entire setting, its unique visual style, its story about discovering Hyrule's lost history beneath the ocean, none of it would exist as we know it. But here's the exciting part. Just because the flood doesn't happen doesn't mean there isn't a cataclysm. Hyrule's history is defined by cycles of peace and destruction. In our unified timeline, when Ganondorf's seal weakens and he threatens to return, perhaps Hyrule faces a different catastrophe. Instead of a flood, maybe Ganondorf's breaking seal causes the sacred realm to bleed into the physical world, creating a twilight convergence where reality itself becomes unstable. Maybe his dark power manifests as a creeping corruption that transforms the land, forcing Hyrule's people to adapt and survive in a world where light and shadow battle for dominance. This brings us to Twilight Princess, a game that exists in the child timeline specifically because young Link warned Hyrule about Ganondorf's treachery, leading to the would-be king's execution. In our unified timeline, there is no child timeline warning, but Ganondorf is still sealed after his defeat by the adult Link. So how does the Twilight Realm factor into our unified history? The Twilight Realm exists independently of the timeline split. It's a separate dimension created when the ancient light spirits banished the dark interlopers who tried to claim the sacred realm. The fused shadow, Zant, Midna, all of these elements come from events that predate Ocarina of Time. This means the Twilight Realm is still part of our unified timeline's history. What changes is how and when Hyrule interacts with the Twilight Realm. In Twilight Princess, Ganondorf's lingering hatred and the execution by the sages create a connection that allows him to empower Zant and attempt invasion through the Twilight. In our unified timeline, Ganondorf isn't executed, he's sealed. This creates different circumstances for the Twilight Realm's interaction with Hyrule. Perhaps Ganondorf's sealed power in the Sacred Realm creates instability between dimensions, and Zant, still ambitious and bitter in the Twilight Realm, finds a way to exploit this instability centuries after Ocarina of Time. Instead of Ganondorf directly empowering Zant, maybe Zant taps into the residual dark energy from Ganondorf's seal, gaining power and attempting to merge the Twilight Realm with Hyrule to claim both kingdoms. This version of the Twilight Crisis would be a direct consequence of Ganondorf's sealing rather than his execution. The story would maintain the core conflict between light and shadow. Link would still encounter Midna and help restore balance to both realms, but the narrative would be streamlined, part of one continuous history rather than a branching alternate reality. The Master Sword's role in a unified timeline deserves special attention. In the fragmented timeline, the Master Sword's power and significance are divided across 3 realities. It exists in the Temple of Time in the adult timeline until it's placed in Ganondorf's head in Wind Waker. It rests in the Sacred Grove in the child timeline during Twilight Princess. In the Downfall timeline, it's hidden and repeatedly rediscovered throughout multiple games. In our unified timeline, the Master Sword has one continuous history. After Link uses it to defeat Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time, the blade would remain in the Temple of Time or be relocated to a sacred resting place, guarded by the royal family or the sages. Each subsequent hero who needs to face Ganondorf's returning threat would journey to claim the same blade, not a version of the Master Sword from a parallel timeline, but the Master Sword, accumulating power and legend with each generation. This creates a beautiful continuity. The sword isn't reset with each timeline, it grows in power. Each hero who wields it adds their courage and experience to its legend. The Master Sword becomes a true accumulation of heroic legacy, binding together every link across the centuries in one unbroken chain of courage. The sages' bloodlines would also maintain continuity. Instead of 7 sages existing across multiple timelines with different identities and purposes, our unified timeline would see the sage lineages continuing from generation to generation. Rauri's legacy, Saria's descendants, Darunia's heir, Ruto's successors, all maintaining the seal on Ganondorf and guarding the sacred realm as part of one continuous duty. This creates a Hyrule with strong spiritual institutions. The sages aren't just figures from legend who appear when needed, they're an established order, a continuous presence in Hyrulean society, preparing for the inevitable day when Ganondorf's seal weakens and the King of Evil must be confronted again. Let's talk about Hyrule's technological and societal progression in a unified timeline.
One of the fascinating aspects of the split timeline is how differently Hyrule develops in each branch. The adult timeline sees technological advancement, with the development of ships, steam-powered devices, and eventually the advanced machinery and spirit tracks. The child timeline maintains a more medieval aesthetic, with a focus on pastoral kingdoms. The downfall timeline cycles through ages of decline and recovery. In our unified timeline, Hyrule's development would follow one consistent path. Without the reset that comes from timeline splits, technological and magical knowledge would build continuously. The ancient Sheikah technology wouldn't be lost and rediscovered multiple times. It would either continue developing or be deliberately sealed away for specific reasons. This is especially relevant when we consider Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The current Zelda games deliberately avoid clarifying which timeline they follow, suggesting they might occur after a convergence or so far in the future that the split timelines have merged. But in our unified timeline, there's no need for convergence. Breath of the Wild would be a direct continuation of one unbroken history. The ancient Sheikah technology seen in Breath of the Wild, divine beasts, guardians, shrines, would have a clear lineage tracing back through Hyrule's unified history. Perhaps this technology developed specifically as a countermeasure to Ganondorf's sealed presence, a civilization-spanning effort to ensure that when the calamity returns, Hyrule would be prepared. The cycle of Calamity Ganon returning every 10,000 years takes on new meaning. In our unified timeline, this isn't just a curse spanning multiple realities, it's the direct consequence of the seal placed on Ganondorf by the Hero of Time and the Seven Sages thousands of years ago. Each manifestation of Calamity Ganon is the same Ganondorf, the same malice, trying to break free from the same ancient seal. This creates profound narrative weight. When Link awakens in the Shrine of Resurrection in Breath of the Wild, he's not just another hero in a vague timeline, he's the spiritual successor to the Hero of Time, inheriting a specific burden that's been passed down through one unbroken line of heroes. His connection to the Master Sword isn't mystical coincidence, it's destiny forged through centuries of continuous history. Zelda's research into ancient technology in Breath of the Wild becomes more purposeful. She's not just investigating mysterious ruins from an ambiguous past, she's studying the legacy of her ancestors who, over thousands of years, developed these weapons specifically to combat the sealed evil that her bloodline has been fighting since the age of the Hero of Time. The champions, Daruk, Mipha, Revali, or Bosa, aren't just warriors chosen by coincidence. In a unified timeline, their races have fought alongside Hyrule's heroes for millennia as part of one continuous alliance. The Gorons remember Darunia's friendship with the Hero of Time. The Zora recall Princess Ruto's role as a sage. The Rito evolved naturally from the Zora over thousands of years, rather than as a result of the Great Flood. The Gerudo carry the complicated legacy of Ganondorf, their greatest shame, as part of their unbroken tribal history. This brings us to one of the most fascinating possibilities. What new adventures could exist in a unified timeline that couldn't happen in the split version? Without the narrative constraints of maintaining 3 separate continuities, game developers would have freedom to explore Hyrule's history as one epic saga. Imagine a game set during the Golden Age that occurs after Ocarina of Time, an era of prosperity where Link's victory brings centuries of peace, allowing Hyrule to truly flourish. Or picture a game focused on the first serious challenge to Ganondorf's seal, perhaps 1,000 years after Ocarina of Time, where a new Link must venture into a partially opened sacred realm to reinforce the barrier, before Ganondorf can fully escape.
This hero wouldn't be facing an alternate version of Ganondorf or a different manifestation. They'd be confronting the same Ganondorf that the Hero of Time sealed, still burning with hatred, still plotting his return. We could see a game exploring the Gerudo's struggle to reclaim their honor in the centuries following their king's betrayal. Without the child timeline where Ganondorf is executed, the Gerudo in our unified timeline must live with the ongoing shame that their greatest king is also Hyrule's greatest enemy, sealed but not destroyed, a constant reminder of their complicated legacy. This could lead to a game revealing the origins of the Zonai and their connection to Hyrule's divine mandate. In our unified timeline, the Zonai wouldn't be mysterious people from an ambiguous past. They'd have a specific place in Hyrule's continuous history, perhaps as ancient allies who helped establish the kingdom, or as the original creators of technology designed to guard against Ganondorf's sealed power.
The possibilities for new stories are endless when you're not constrained by maintaining consistency across 3 separate timelines. Let's address the downfall timeline specifically, because its absence creates the most dramatic changes. The downfall timeline contains some of the most beloved classic Zelda games: A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Oracle of Seasons and Ages, the original Legend of Zelda, and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. All of these games exist because of the premise that Link failed in Ocarina of Time. In our unified timeline, where Link succeeds, none of these events occur as we know them. There's no imprisoning war because Ganondorf never claims the complete Triforce. There's no need for the events of A Link to the Past because Hyrule doesn't fall into an age of darkness. The original Legend of Zelda's backstory about Ganon being defeated and his followers trying to resurrect him, all of that stems from the downfall timeline. This is a massive change. Some of the series' most iconic adventures simply don't exist in this unified history. But here's the thing. The themes and concepts from those games could still manifest in different forms. The imprisoning war might not happen, but perhaps there's a different great conflict, a war not about imprisoning Ganondorf, but about maintaining his seal when it begins to weaken. A Link to the Past's dark world could be reimagined as the Sacred Realm becoming corrupted over time by Ganondorf's sealed presence, requiring a hero to venture into it and purify the corruption before it leaks into Hyrule. The Oracle game's time travel and seasonal manipulation could occur as separate adventures unrelated to Ganondorf's fate. Link's Awakening's dream island of Koholint could still exist as a mystical realm that a different Link encounters on a sea voyage. These stories don't have to disappear. They just need to be untethered from the downfall timeline's specific causality. This is where creative reimagining becomes exciting. Nintendo could take the best elements from all 3 timelines and weave them into one cohesive narrative. Toon Link's adventure doesn't need the Great Flood. He could be a hero from a different era, exploring uncharted islands or discovering ancient ruins. The dark, apocalyptic tone of the Downfall games could manifest in a different crisis, perhaps the first time Ganondorf's seal nearly breaks and Hyrule teeters on the edge of destruction. The unified timeline becomes a tapestry where the best story elements from Zelda's history are preserved and integrated into one legendary saga. Now let's talk about what this means for the legend itself, the actual in-universe mythology that gives the series its name. In the fragmented timeline, the legend of the hero becomes complicated and fractured. Different eras remember different heroes, different victories, different Links fighting different versions of the same evil. The prophecy of the hero reborn becomes tangled across parallel realities. In our unified timeline, the legend becomes stronger and more coherent. There's one line of heroes, all spiritual successors to the original Hero of Time, all wielding the same Master Sword, all inheriting the same Triforce of Courage, all fighting the same evil that was first sealed by their legendary predecessor thousands of years ago. The prophecy would be clear and unambiguous. When evil returns, the hero will rise. Not when evil returns in one of 3 possible timelines, just when evil returns. Period. The cycle of the hero's rebirth becomes a direct spiritual inheritance rather than a confusing multiversal phenomenon. This creates powerful narrative resonance.
Each Link isn't just a hero, he's the hero, the latest manifestation of an unbroken chain of courage that stretches back to the original hero of time. When a new Link picks up the Master Sword, he's not claiming a weapon from some alternate reality, he's taking up the exact blade that the original Link used to seal Ganondorf thousands of years ago. The Zelda in each era isn't just named after the princess from Ocarina of Time, she's part of an unbroken royal bloodline that has been guarding the Triforce of Wisdom and maintaining Ganondorf's seal for millennia. The tradition of naming every Princess Zelda as established in Zelda 2 takes on deeper meaning in a unified timeline where the first Princess Zelda who helped seal Ganondorf becomes the foundational figure of an unbroken dynasty. Ganondorf or Ganon's role as the eternal evil becomes more focused and terrifying. He's not three different versions of evil across three timelines, he's one singular force of malevolence that refuses to die, refuses to be sealed, returns again and again throughout history in increasingly desperate and dangerous attempts to break free and claim his revenge.
The Triforce's legend would crystallize into a clear mythology. The golden power split among three worthy bearers, courage with the hero, wisdom with the princess, power with the sealed king of evil. Generation after generation inheriting these pieces, maintaining the balance, preventing any one force from claiming all three and reshaping the world. This unified legend could become Hyrule's central religious and historical narrative. The Temple of Time wouldn't just be a mysterious ruin that appears in different eras. It would be the Temple of Time, the sacred site where the hero of time first drew the Master Sword, where the seven sages gathered to seal Ganondorf, where the course of Hyrule's entire history was determined. It would be a continuous pilgrimage site, maintained across the centuries, the physical anchor of Hyrule's most important legend. The royal family's role in guarding the Triforce of Wisdom becomes an explicit sacred duty passed from mother to daughter for thousands of years. The Sheikah's mission to serve the royal family and protect Hyrule's secrets becomes a continuous tradition rather than something that appears and disappears across different timelines. The Gorons, Zora, Rito, Gerudo, all of these races would have unbroken histories of alliance or conflict with Hyrule, stretching back to the age of the hero of time. Every monument, every ruin, every ancient text would have a clear place in one continuous history, rather than potentially referring to events from different timeline branches. Archaeologists in Breath of the Wild wouldn't be confused about which era certain ruins belong to. They'd be able to trace clear historical progression from the age of the hero of time through thousands of years of unified development. The impact on fan understanding and engagement would be dramatic. Let's be honest, the timeline split has been both a blessing and a curse for the Zelda fandom. On one hand, it provides fascinating complexity and allows for deep theoretical discussions. On the other hand, it creates confusion, arguments about continuity, and barriers for newcomers trying to understand how the games connect. A unified timeline would make the series far more accessible. You wouldn't need a flowchart to understand how the games relate to each other. It would be simple. These events happened in this order, each building on the last. One continuous story of Hyrule's rise, challenges, and perseverance. New fans wouldn't feel overwhelmed by the question, which timeline should I follow? There would be one timeline, one history. Play the games in release order or chronological order, but either way, you're experiencing one cohesive narrative. This would also give Nintendo's developers much more freedom. Instead of having to worry about which timeline branch a new game fits into and how it affects continuity in three separate realities, they could simply add to one ongoing story. Every new Zelda game would just be the next chapter in Hyrule's continuous saga. But here's the interesting tension. Would a unified timeline actually be better? The timeline split, for all its complexity, has allowed for incredible creative diversity. The adult timeline gave us Wind Waker's unique ocean setting and art style. The child timeline produced Twilight Princess's darker, more realistic tone.
The downfall timeline includes beloved classics that defined the series. A unified timeline might create coherence, but would it limit creative possibilities? Would every Zelda game need to maintain visual and thematic consistency with one continuous history? Would we lose the ability to have dramatically different artistic interpretations and settings? Maybe the answer is that the timeline split was actually a genius solution to a creative problem. How do you make a series about the same conflict between the same archetypes, Link, Zelda, Ganon, interesting across dozens of games spanning decades? You create multiple timelines so you can explore radically different outcomes and settings while maintaining core continuity. Our unified timeline thought experiment reveals what would be gained: clarity, accessibility, narrative weight, but also what might be lost: creative flexibility, diverse interpretations, the freedom to contradict. Perhaps the real genius of Zelda's storytelling is that it can accommodate both approaches. The recent Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom games deliberately avoid specific timeline placement, suggesting that maybe in the far future the timelines have converged or become irrelevant. The ancient past is so distant that whether it was one timeline or three doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is the eternal cycle of the hero, the princess, and the calamity. This brings us to the ultimate question: should Nintendo actually consolidate the timeline?
Arguments for unification. Easier for fans to understand and follow. Creates stronger narrative connections between games. Allows developers more freedom by simplifying continuity constraints. Makes the series more accessible to newcomers. Concentrates the legend into one powerful mythology. Arguments for maintaining the split. Preserves the unique identity and setting of each timeline branch. Allows for greater creative diversity across games. Maintains the established lore that fans have studied for years. Provides fodder for fascinating fan discussions and theories. Acknowledges that retconning decades of established continuity would be controversial. The truth is, the timeline split is now such a fundamental part of Zelda's identity that removing it would be nearly impossible without angering significant portions of the fanbase. But the thought experiment of imagining a unified timeline helps us appreciate what makes Zelda special. It's a series flexible enough to tell the same story in radically different ways, to explore the eternal conflict between good and evil from multiple angles, to be both one legend and many legends at the same time. What if Ocarina of Time's timeline never split? We'd have a simpler, more coherent narrative where every game builds directly on the last, where Hyrule's history flows in one unbroken stream from the age of the hero of time through thousands of years to the distant future of Breath of the Wild and beyond. We'd have a Ganondorf whose evil isn't divided but concentrated, making him either more dangerous or easier to defeat, depending on whether his power consolidates or whether Hyrule's accumulated knowledge gives them the advantage. We'd have a Master Sword that grows in power and legend with each generation rather than existing in multiple states across parallel realities. We'd have races, kingdoms, and civilizations with clear, unbroken histories of development and relationship with Hyrule. We'd have a Triforce whose division among courage, wisdom, and power represents an ongoing sacred trust rather than a mystical object that scatters and reforms across multiple dimensions. We'd have to reimagine or lose some beloved games. No Majora's Mask as we know it, no Wind Waker's Great Sea, no A Link to the Past's Imprisoning War, but we'd gain the potential for entirely new adventures that could only exist in one continuous history. And we'd have a legend that's truly singular, one unbroken chain of heroes, one continuous royal dynasty, one eternal battle between light and darkness playing out across thousands of years of unified mythology. The timeline split exists, and it's unlikely to go anywhere, but imagining its absence helps us understand both what it provides and what it costs. The Legend of Zelda is unique precisely because it can be both fractured and whole,
both multiple timelines and one eternal story, both complex mythology and simple fairy tale. Whether Hyrule's history flows in one stream or branches into many rivers, the core truth remains the same. A hero will rise, evil will be challenged, courage, wisdom, and power will clash, and the legend will continue. That's what makes The Legend of Zelda timeless. Not the number of timelines, but the eternal themes that persist regardless of how history unfolds. Whether time splits or stays unified, the spirit of the hero endures. The princess's wisdom guides the kingdom, and the battle against darkness continues. The timeline split might add complexity, but it doesn't change the fundamental truth at the heart of every Zelda game. This is a story about courage triumphing over evil, about the cycle of destruction and rebirth, about hope persisting even when all seems lost. That story works in one timeline or three, in the distant past or the far future, in bright cartoon seas or shadowy Twilight realms. So what if Ocarina of Time's timeline never split? We'd have a different Zelda series, simpler in some ways, more limited in others, but still fundamentally the same legend of heroes, princesses, and eternal battles that have captivated players for nearly 4 decades. The Legend of Zelda doesn't need timeline complexity to be legendary, but it doesn't hurt either. Whether unified or fractured, linear or branching, simple or complex, the legend endures because at its heart, it tells a truth that resonates across every timeline, every reality, every version of Hyrule that could possibly exist. The hero will rise, evil will fall. The legend continues. And that is what happens when you imagine Ocarina of Time's timeline never split. You realize that while the structure might change, the soul of the series remains eternal, unbreakable, and truly legendary.